So the Systems Map live discussion series is an opportunity to give depth to this tool that the SCA has created. There's a lot of complexity to the map as it is, but not a lot of explanation as to why the relationships exist between actors and activities. There's not really a way to depict in this map how these actors on the outer ring are connected to one another. And through this discussion series, we'll be diving into the lived experiences of people who work in these roles of farming and processing and exporting, importing, roasting, and brewing to better understand how they see themselves situated and who they feel connected to, where they would like to have deeper connections or stronger connections. Over the course of 4 conversations, we'll get to know some people who are involved in actual coffee value chains and hear their perspectives on what's working for them. I think farming is probably the thing that we romanticize the most in coffee. Certainly more photogenic. We like to take pictures of farming in a way that we don't maybe like to take pictures of some of the other activities that come between farming and brewing. Then who are they connected to? Is it to just other people who are involved in the chain? Is it to research institutions? Is it to financial institutions? And where there are gaps in those connections that farmers have, why do those gaps exist? Why aren't farmers more connected? This might be one of the areas where we've seen the most innovation happen, and I think that's telling of the need to add value to green coffee and how coffee producers have seen this as a way in which they can differentiate themselves. Depending on where we're talking about and the size of the farm, processing and farming can all be done by the same person or the same small team of people. They can also be done by very different people at very different scales and without a lot of contact between those 2 activities. One thing that might surprise you about exporting is how paper-based it is. So given that this is one of the activities in the systems map where there's the most concentration, so there are the fewest companies, say, compared to brewing or compared to farming or even to roasting, there's remarkably little technology that has come in and really transformed how exporting happens. It reminds me a little bit of traveling with a passport and thinking about how with all of the technology that we have access to in the world, we still rely on this little piece of glorified paper to prove our identity. And without it, we end up stranded. And the same thing is true with these bills of lading in exporting terms, that without documentation, coffee can end up without an identity and it can end up stranded. So coffee importing and coffee exporting are often connected. Sometimes, especially when we're talking about large, multinational traders, it's basically the same organization that's in charge of both of them, but they're not always the same. And I think that if we want to understand better the value that importers bring to the value chain, if we understand their contribution to the system, as well as what they take from the system, then we'd be wise to look at them separately as well as looking at them together. In the past few years, as we've seen this tidal wave, as Jan Anderson calls it, of small roasters, the role of the importer has really changed. And we have a lot more small importers and a lot more of a local presence. So it's possible that an importer really knows a retailer, that they're really connected to the people who are doing the brewing of the coffee and not just to the people who are roasting coffee, as I think would have been more the case 10 or 15 years ago. Roasting is a very charismatic activity. When you think about watching a roaster sniff the coffee trier when they pull it out of the machine to see where it is in the roasting process, or when you imagine the sound of coffee beans in the cooling tray being raked around by those metal arms. When we're talking about roasting, the scale of the business matters a lot, because looking at all of the activities in the activity map, roasting, being closer to the middle, is one of those areas where there's comparative concentration. And it's also one of the areas where there's more of the total value of coffee captured here in roasting than in stages like, than in the activities of farming or of brewing, for example. But a small-scale coffee roasting company is going to really struggle to be profitable in a way that would be really familiar to a small cafe or to a small farm. Sometimes roasting and brewing as activities are very closely connected. Like they're done by the same company or even maybe by the same person. But even when they're not explicitly connected, the relationship there is really important, because depending on the way that coffee is roasted and the style of roasting and the level of roast, it's really going to change how that coffee behaves when it's being brewed. And if the person who's doing the brewing isn't cognizant of those differences, then that experience of brewing can be a very frustrating one. But most of the time when we're talking about brewing, we're talking about preparing a beverage, and that can be done by a professional, or it can be done by someone who's not a professional, say in their home. And that's one of the things that makes coffee brewing interesting, is that there's this mix of professional and non-professional that happens in this activity that's pretty unique. The fact that there are so many people involved in coffee brewing or adjacent to coffee brewing means that there's a lot of potential power here. During this 4-episode series, we'll talk to people who are working in each of these activities, and we'll hear their perspectives on where they see opportunities, where they see gaps, why these gaps exist, and in so doing, start to develop a better sense for ourselves as a community of where the needs are and how we can work together to make a map that is inclusive and representative in order to reflect a supply chain that is equitable and sustainable for everyone involved in it.